And welcome to the School Leadership Show. I am Jenn David Lang, co-host, and unfortunately, Mike had a last-minute meeting come up, so he couldn't join us. So I regret that he can't join us today. He's going to regret it, I'm sure, once he hears this conversation. I have so been looking forward to chatting with you. I am here today with Andrea Terrero Gabbadon, who wrote a very recent book, Support and Retain Educators of Color. So certainly something that I imagine many of our listeners will be very interested in hearing about. So Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. It may seem very obvious why you would write a book like this, but maybe if you want to share personally and professionally, how did you come to write this book?
So I set out, oh goodness, so many years ago, thinking about how can we make teachers better, right? I had recently entered my doctoral program. I had recently come out of my school leader role. And so I wanted to do research around how can we get teachers to do better in their roles and be more effective. And as I set out to do research, I found out, part of the reason why, we are having questions and seeking how to improve teacher practices because teachers aren't staying in the field as long as they once were. The majority of my career has been in the urban context, and there's particular concern in the urban context around teacher turnover, but then also turnover around teachers of color, as we know, bring a variety of benefits for our kiddos. And so that really was the catalyst that took me to the research that then led to the book.
Great. Yeah, fantastic. And great that you have a history as a school leader as well. Where were you a school leader, may I ask?
Of course, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, city of brotherly love, right, and sisterly affection. I worked as a director of curriculum and instruction, as well as an assistant principal at a charter school.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, great city. Well, good. Well, I'm so glad you're here. I was explaining to Andrea that I invited her here because I really like that her approach is not a quick fix, because it's not a challenge for which there is a quick fix. So I really appreciated your approach to this. Research has shown that there are many reasons why educators of color in particular are leaving the profession. We know that many educators are leaving. Unfortunately, this is a challenging time in this post-pandemic world. And you have some statistics about the top 5 reasons for departure. I don't know if you have them at your fingertips, if you want to share some of the most popular ones, or I have them at mine, but I'd rather hear from you. What are you finding that the research says is the reason teachers of color are leaving?
I think there's 2 big things that we need to zoom in on with the research. I think more broadly, we're seeing disparities between why teachers of color leave and why white teachers leave, right? So white teachers, and there's a variety of complex factors, right? But if we zoom in, there's this kind of overwhelming data that says that folks are leaving for, better paying jobs, they're retiring, right? Like largely positive life changes. But when we're looking at teachers of color, we're seeing that folks are leaving largely because of poor working conditions and poor leadership behaviors. And so when we say poor leadership behaviors, I want to be clear around like behaviors, mindsets, and actions that are coercive, that are negative, or that are undermining kind of the positive way teachers of color feel about their work, and therefore kind of influence their decision making to leave. And so it's really grounded in how can we improve like the context where teachers of color are in order to promote them to stay, right? Because we don't want to see these disparities between white folks and folks of color. We want to definitely create equity, and not just equity around reasons for turnover, but equity for reasons why folks want to stay, because that really is at the heart of it.
Well, and there's been such an approach. There's been such a cry lately to try to hire more teachers and educators of color. So if you're going to put all this energy into hiring, certainly you don't want those educators to turn around and leave your school, let alone the profession, so soon afterwards. So yeah, I appreciated the stats and the 2 things you mentioned, right? Working conditions and leadership behaviors. Those are things that leaders listening right now at the school and the district level can actually impact. So I appreciate that your book identified the problems and then has some really concrete suggestions for how we might move forward, right? And I'm sure a lot of people are listening, uh-oh, leadership behaviors, right? What could I be doing differently? Which is a good way to listen. And so you come up with, and it's the subheading for your book, 6 principles for culturally affirming leadership as ways of addressing this challenge. So I just thought that maybe we could go through the 6 and just give a few ideas for our listeners. So the first principle you say is to acknowledge that educator diversity matters. Now, people listening may be like, oh, okay, but isn't that obvious? Or, what's the connection between acknowledging that it matters and the educators of color in my building staying? So tell us a little bit more about this first principle.
I mean, I think so often we hear, we need teachers of color. And that kind of phrase is connected to how can we promote or impact positive outcomes, particularly for students of color, right? And we know students of color largely have faced a host of structural and institutional inequalities. And so we look at teachers of color largely as one of the levers to improve or to combat, right, that systemic inequality. And so in that chapter, I argue that we need to acknowledge that teacher diversity matters, not as a quick fix to support students who have been systemically underserved, but rather teachers of color bring a host of benefits for all students. In addition, there's a deep and beautiful and rich legacy around the history of teachers of color. I dive deeply into the history, particularly of Black education in the United States, just because it's so beautifully documented and it's so far reaching. And it's within that history of Black education that we learn about Black educators being advocates for public education, for social justice, for improving outcomes for all kiddos, right? And so when we acknowledge one, right, like this group of people is not a monolith, right? They're good for all kiddos. They're not a quick fix. And this isn't like a new trendy thing that we want to call on this group of people. No, they have a beautiful legacy that we need to tap into and learn from in order to improve teaching and learning and outcomes for all kiddos. And so within acknowledging that teacher diversity matters, again, it's kind of going a little bit further beyond some of those tropes, those stereotypes, those assumptions that we often have around why we need teachers of color in our building.
And we see in that beautiful history that educators of color have historically impacted students of color very powerfully. And then you also have a section, and you did use the term all students, that research has shown all of the benefits that educators of color have, even for students who don't look like them or come from similar backgrounds. And so that may be something that is newer to some leaders or something that they might find of interest, right? That educators of color are helping to impact student performance on, standardized tests, but also on things like being able to work in a diverse workforce in the 21st century, and just getting kids to be more engaged. And it's very powerful, the research you share of the impact of educators of color on all of students. So this, go ahead. Did you want to add anything to that or?
No, certainly. I mean, I think about, we're preparing all kiddos, right, to be competitive, to exist in a global economy, right? And so in order to do that, we need to have, that kind of international, global, multiple perspectives, kind of landscape represented in our schools, right? And so when we talk about how we're preparing kiddos for the next phase of life and how to engage, not just within their communities, but beyond. Again, we need to have a workforce that reflects the diversity of not just the United States, but even beyond that, so that our kiddos have a sense of how do they engage, how do they work across difference, how do they understand different perspectives. I mean, those are skills, right, that children can learn from the earliest of ages, right? And so just another reason why we need to have a teacher workforce, right, that reflects not just the diversity of our students, but kind of on a more global scale.
The ideal. And I love that that's preparing the foundation, and you're not necessarily yelling like, go out and do, but first, start with this acknowledgement, right? And then for the second principle as well, You say the second principle to help us better support and retain educators of color is to cultivate reflection and self-awareness. And so again, right, being the skeptical listener or principal, right, so how is my reflection and my self-awareness going to keep my educators of color on board? If you want to talk a little bit about that. And I do like, throughout the book, you share the voices of educators of color and some anecdotes that help to illustrate some of the points. But I don't know if you want to answer that first, and then I wanted to hear a little bit about Diane or Atik, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, why is it important to cultivate reflection, self-awareness? I always call on the great poet Lauryn Hill, right? AKA the rapper, whose iconic album, right, is about 20 something years old now. So I'm dating myself. But she talks about how can you win if you ain't right within, right? And I always pull from that line because folks, school leaders that I come across, school leaders that I work with, even leaders that I have chatted with in my research, um, there's this, I get the sense that the leaders who are willing to be introspective about their leadership behaviors are the ones who are most willing to listen to teachers, to acknowledge their lived experiences, and the ones who are willing to make the changes necessary to improve the conditions that educators are finding themselves within their buildings. And so when we talk about cultivate reflection, self-awareness, because this book is largely around race and identity, I talk about how we need to be introspective around race. And so it is impossible to cultivate the necessary anti-racism or anti-racist behaviors and actions that are necessary to retain educators of color if you're colorblind. And so in the book, I really walk through folks, and supporting them to think about what are my beliefs around race and identity? In what ways do I engage with this in school? And this isn't geared primarily towards white educators or white identifying educators. That's the common assumption. I argue, and others would agree with me as well, that all folks, regardless of racial identity, of background, of intersection of identities, really need to reflect on the ways in which we have internalized problematic assumptions because we live in America, right? With with tropes, with stereotypes, with the smog, right, of problematic assumptions around folks of color. And so we all have to do that work of relearning so that we can do better to really center the voices of educators of color, which I try to do in the book.
Well, I share a love of the miseducation of Lauryn Hill with you and date myself along with you. But good thing this podcast is for ears. No one can see our age. But no, I think some of the words that you use to describe the skills of a leader that would be more likely to retain educators of color. You talked about listening, right? You really describe it, humility. I think we're moving away from an older model of leadership, which sometimes we do think of as a little more male and white, but where the where the leader is able to be challenged on a decision or an action. And that's okay. And there's room for growth and listening and feedback. And I would have to imagine those qualities would help make the school more humane for all educators. And you give a couple of examples, so in the book you share Diane, who's a Black woman who has been teaching in urban schools for over 15 years and just has, stellar achievement outcomes with her students. But because, her classroom is orderly, right? She's called on for a lot of, cover these classes or come in where there's a discipline issue. And, she hasn't really been acknowledged for her content expertise. So I imagine, bringing something like that to a leader or for a leader not to carve out time and think about what's going on here. Where do you see the self-reflection in this kind of a story that you include in the chapter?
One thing that I think is important to raise, right, is the fact that all the stories in the book are the stories of real people, right? And they are symbolic of not just individuals, but the ways in which educators of color are experiencing their schools. And so we need to think as leaders around those critical kind of social and cultural dynamics, and how they're finding themselves, right? How are they emerging in our buildings? And so, more practically, what does that mean, right? So, with Diane in particular, again, amazing woman, commanding presence, but always positioned as that disciplinarian. That often for her was rooted in that stereotype or that trope, right, of like the strong Black woman, right? She can do it, she has it, she doesn't need help. But when she wanted to kind of move beyond the classroom teacher role, take on more leadership, she constantly was not listened to, she was undermined, she was passed by for these leadership opportunities. And, if you are reading the news, if you are listening to what's happening, this is something that Black women are constantly experiencing, and uniquely experiencing, right? Where their competency is questioned, where they're passed by for leadership. And if, when they are becoming leaders, right, their leadership is scrutinized very closely, right? And so we need to think as leaders, right? And this goes back to this idea of cultivating reflection. How are these kind of social stereotypes, these cultural dynamics, these tropes impacting teachers? In what ways am I complicit by assuming, right, by nature of your race or your identity, that you're the awesome disciplinarian, but that's it, and that's all you're good for, right? We need to get at the heart of, why isn't this teacher being introduced to leadership opportunities? Why is she being overlooked? We need to listen to her. She says she's being overlooked. Why? Right? Not just saying, oh, that's just her, not brushing it off. And I think, again, that really causes us to be uncomfortable in our leadership, because sometimes that causes us to stop and really question our assumptions. But it's critical for us to center their voices and think about what is happening to you, what is happening in your world, and in what ways are my behaviors or my actions contributing potentially to the ways in which you are being racialized, in the workplace.
And you mentioned the disparity between intent and impact, right? So maybe the principal thinks, oh, here I'm highlighting this teacher. My intention is to elevate her and congratulate her, but the impact is that I'm ignoring this whole other side. The primary reason she's in the profession, not to be a disciplinarian, but to teach. And so some of that may come from principle two, my own ability to reflect and be self-aware, but some of it may not. And that comes to the third principle, which is that to retain and support our educators of color, we need to assess and plan for action. And you talk in this chapter about 4 areas where the research says are primary areas that are leading to educators of color leaving, right? The school vision and mission, the culture of the leadership at the school, the dynamics among the staff, and the instructional culture. And, you really talk about, before jumping in, because you don't know as the leader really what is causing people to leave, to gather some evidence and to do a little bit of, assessing or researching what's going on in your school. And you really talk about the pulse meeting. So could you talk a little bit about this step where you're pausing and you're not jumping in, but you're trying to gather a little more information first?
So at one of the kind of core things, right, or the underlying messages in the book is, in order to support and retain educators of color, we need to make sure that our schools are places that are welcoming and affirming, right, to educators of color. And so before we want to run full speed ahead and create all these initiatives, which I see schools doing all the time, and I see districts implementing these wonderful strategies, right? But these strategies are not addressing the root issues as to why teachers of color are leaving, right? And so it's critical to first explore, what are the factors, right? If anything, what are the factors that are causing folks to leave? And I walk through folks, look at the school vision, the leadership culture, staff dynamics, and instructional culture, just as different areas of a school building or of a district in which folks can explore. The pulse meetings really are ways that educators or leaders can talk to educators themselves. I think, folks want to look at the data. And I think that is great. I think quantitative data is important. We need to look at the numbers, who's leaving, who's not leaving. We need to look at that information in disaggregated form, and also to get a closer or better sense as to how different subgroups are impacted. But the power of the pulse meeting is to listen to someone's voice and story, which is what I really try to get across in the book, in that some of the issues that are causing teachers of color to leave are things that may not be captured in a survey, but can be better understood when you sit and you listen to someone. And therefore, when you're creating that strategy that centers the problems that folks are raising, you are better equipped to have a plan, a more effective plan that will support or that will create systems of support that feel supportive to educators of color, right? That create systems that are welcoming to them versus what you think, right, is welcoming. No, put aside your assumptions. Let's center the voices of folks by having a quick cup of coffee, 15 minutes. What's going on? How are you experiencing? How can I support you? In what ways, what have we done well? Where are we falling short? Just quick questions. Obviously, they need to be done in a very kind of low pressure environment. They can be done by bringing in an external consultant in the case that the relationships in the building are not so that the truth emerges, because that's critical as well. But again, we need to center folks' voices and experiences in order to create systems that are actually affirming.
I want to highlight a few things you said. First of all, not asking to dump more initiatives on, but just the power of listening to make sure that the changes you make are reflecting the challenges in your specific building or district. The second thing, if it wasn't clear to listeners, is that my understanding is that the pulse meetings are with your educators of color specifically. And those are the voices that may not always be as heard. So, and you give a very specific, I believe, schedule one-on-one meetings with educators of color quarterly. And what I love about this, and I love the fact that it's February now, so it is Black History Month, but the point of your book is not to confine this to something you do in a month, but quarterly, year round. And this is a great way so that we do not find ourselves in June with your educators of color quitting en masse, right? The idea is that it is preventative. When you interview those educators of color after they quit in May or June, that is an autopsy. So you're asking in these pulse meetings for our leaders to do a checkup and a check-in while there's still time to actually, if you're really listening, make those changes. So that's why I found this so powerful, this particular section, because you could, like everybody, if you are listening to this, put down in your calendar right now, I'm going to send out invites. I'm going to go schedule these meetings and do them all by the end of February or March so that you can get into the habit of doing these meetings and prevent some of the departures. I am sensitive to time. I will move on. The fourth principle, and this is where you start to act after laying the groundwork to prepare yourself in your school. Principle 4, commit to sustainable, high impact instructional supports. That is supporting teachers. Now, again, most people are like, okay, yes, we should be supporting teachers. I'm a principal. That is my job. Why is it particularly important to support educators of color instructionally? Why do you highlight that?
In the book, I raised two important points that emerge in the research, not just the research based more broadly, but even my own findings, that dissatisfaction with instructional support strongly correlates to teachers of color deciding to leave their jobs. And then the second thing is that educators of color actually tend to get less instructional support as well as teacher preparation on average. And so we want to create systems of support that convey the message of not only do I support you because you impact kiddos in my building, but I am providing a holistic menu of supports because I honor your contributions here in my building as an educator of color. If we were to go back to the story of Diane, right, someone who was an amazing disciplinarian, who was able to achieve great outcomes with her kiddos. There may be, right, for example, ways in which she might want to grow in other areas, but because let's say she's she has strong rapport with students, she might be overlooked. She may not be given content related support, or maybe she wants to explore a new pedagogical approach. Because she's good at some things, it's considered, well, she's good enough, she's fine, let's go support the rooms that are on fire, which unfortunately those rooms that tend to be on fire are the newer teachers, typically the white female teachers, to be frank, those that don't reflect the backgrounds of their kiddos, and therefore often experience cultural clashes in the classroom. And so in my research, I came across tons of teachers who, again, great disciplinarians or great relationships with kids, or were from the community, but they felt, my kids need more, I need more, I'm not getting more because my room looks fine. There's assumptions that I have this, but I really don't. And so again, the call for leaders is to think about, how can we test our assumptions about the rooms that look fine, and really zoom in on how do these teachers want to grow, and what ways are we overlooking their professional needs, and how can I meet those needs?
I mean, I think that's a great thing for leaders to focus on. If you're going into rooms, right, and as you write in the book, right, the room isn't on fire, that doesn't mean good instruction is going on. And so is that, again, something to self-reflect? Am I not looking for the right things? Am I not comfortable giving feedback? If I don't look like my educators of color, do I not feel comfortable giving feedback? Have I not created the culture in my school where I can give teachers honest, critical, supportive feedback so they can take the next steps? So now is a great time to really make sure that on your calendar, you've got some observations, you've got some meetings with your teachers of color, and you really are thinking about instruction, because that's why they're there. And, what kind of meaningful feedback can you give, and what kind of dialogue? And even for the Dianes who their classrooms are not on fire and they are doing an incredible job instructionally, maybe they could be leading some professional learning sessions with the rest of your staff. Maybe they can be mentoring others. There are other ways to acknowledge, even if their classroom is not falling apart instructionally, but some of that acknowledgement.
And I think,
yeah.
Can I just, I would like to add too, many times when I'm talking to leaders, their assumption is, well, I don't have the capacity, right? I can't be everywhere. I don't have all the content expertise. I can't provide all the PDs. And I get that, right? As a former school leader, I completely understand. I knew my lane. I stayed in my lane, and I think folks respected me for it, and my building was better for it. And I was able to tap into the people who were great in other respects, and provide those leadership opportunities. And so you mentioned feedback, right? Observation and feedback is a great way to support a teacher. But in what ways, perhaps, are we missing out on maybe teacher leadership opportunities? Again, studies indicate, findings reveal that teachers of color are often overlooked for leadership opportunities. So how can we create, to your point, Jenn, right, leadership opportunities where we're maximizing the strength of leaders of color to support other teachers, and that we're not also imposing an unpaid burden on them, right? We want to, if we're putting the folks in teacher leadership positions, we need to pay them accordingly, right? Because there's a lot to be said around the ways in which we invite educators of color into our building, and then we intend to exploit their labor by not compensating them accordingly, right? And so we want to make sure that we're not doing that. And then another piece is supporting an educator can also include just caring about them as a person. It can be connecting them to resources. So if you know of a free PD or something that's of interest, particularly to a teacher, or if you have community connections, introduce those to your teachers. Be clear on the ways in which you want to provide support by connecting them to resources that perhaps exist outside of your building. It could also be just covering a class, right? There's a variety of ways that we can support educators and honor them and honor their humanity, to uplift them in ways that, frankly, really don't require any money, right? But it just is around really acknowledging the contributions that they bring to the building, and acknowledging the ways that they need to be supported, and then following through.
And all those things you just mentioned are things that, if you develop a habit of listening, whether you call them pulse meetings or not, that can come up, right? So if one of your teachers of color is overburdened because you've asked them to lead 3 classroom management workshops, and now you're saying, and now also I want you to lead, workshops on literacy, right? Well, I'm not being, listen, talk to them. You don't know if an email in your inbox comes across your desk for a free workshop on AI that some of your educators of color are deeply interested in incorporating, different AI techniques into their teaching if you haven't spoken to them, if you haven't listened. So I think that the principles they connect to each other as well. They're not staccato, separate. The fifth principle is to foster supportive environments for culturally responsive approaches. So culturally responsive teaching, learning, what is the connection between supporting this and encouraging our teachers of color and educators of color to stay?
Culturally responsive teaching is powerful for all students, right? But has specific benefits for students of color, right? To be reflected in the curriculum, for their voice to be centered. Many times there's a social justice orientation where students are encouraged to challenge the status quo in ways that actually supports their academic and educational outcomes, right? And so I write about, culture responsive teaching isn't just about the heroes and holidays. It's not about just the multicultural fair, right? That's fun, that's good, right? But that's not just it. And educators of color largely are coming into schools or coming into the profession wanting to implement this type of pedagogy. They may not have the exact language for it, but they want to teach in ways that reflects and honors their students' backgrounds. But countless time, educators of color are brought into our buildings, but they're confronted with curriculum, with instructional mandates that are in direct opposition, right, to the type of instruction that they want to have in their building and the type of instruction that they know is impactful for their students. And so when I write about fostering supportive environments for culturally responsive ways of teaching, I am encouraging, if not challenging, leaders to think about it's not sufficient just to have an educator of color in your building, but are you creating systems and spaces of autonomy that allows them to teach in ways that they know are impactful for their young people? Are you, first of all, what do you know about culturally responsive ways of instruction? And how are you creating space for your students to be reflected, and then also for teachers to bring the fullness of who they are to the curriculum, bringing the ways of knowledge that they have, the ways of being, their cultural knowledge, all of that into the curriculum in ways that's enriching for students.
I think that if you're a leader who has been questioning the standardized curriculum, the amount of time spent on test prep for standardized tests, then this just adds more of an argument for moving away from that, because it is not what is most benefiting kids, but it's also encouraging your teachers to lead. Nobody wants to work in an environment like that, but particularly if research shows that that's part of the reason teachers of color enter the field is to teach in a way that makes the most sense given who the students are, then it is an opportunity to move toward, as you say, a space of autonomy. So if you have a highly scripted curriculum, even if you have to use the curriculum, find those spaces in the curriculum where there can be some autonomy, some wiggle room. Black History Month, take some of these resources that everyone is sending around and encourage that your teachers use them year round, not just for the month of February. You mentioned the organization Learning for Justice, formerly known as Teaching Tolerance. Many people may know there are a lot of rich materials that are going to benefit your students. And if you only knew that it would benefit your students, now this conversation with Andrea can help you realize it's also going to benefit your teachers of color in terms of this is how they want to teach and the kind of school that they want to stay in. So I think that's a very, very powerful reminder. And then the final thing is the principle 6, lead for an inclusive community. And, I like how you describe that a diverse community, right, has people from different backgrounds, but an inclusive community really welcomes and includes people from different backgrounds. I have here on my desk. I'm reading also Ruchika's book, Inclusion on Purpose. I'm sure you've read it as well. Um, but yeah, and you want to talk a little bit about this inclusive community and what are the things principals can do to help build one?
So that last principle really gets at this idea of how are we addressing the racial climate and racialized systems of power within the school, right? And so we can give teachers all of the autonomy. We can be truly reflective. We can acknowledge, right? We can do all the principles, right? But if that educator of color is leaving their classroom and is facing a hostile racial climate in the interactions with their colleagues and the interactions with other leaders, interactions with parents and community members, right? Then, like, our work is not done. And so, this last principle really gets at um, how are you centering um, this idea of uh, racial inclusion, of affirming, of welcoming, of shared listening, of introspection, all the things that you're doing as a leader. How are you conveying or supporting um, other invested partners in the school to embody those same principles, right? So that it's not just the leader who is embodying culturally affirming leadership, but everyone is fully participating in that work. And so we often think of equity training, right? Cultural competency training as perhaps something on the checklist that needs to get done. That's great, but in what ways are people embodying those principles beyond the training of really engaging across the lines of race, of culture, of age, and other identity markers to really have this community where folks are listening to each other, where folks are supporting each other, where life experiences are exchanged and understood. And ultimately, it really comes to power, right? And how we're engaging those power dynamics as a community.
And go to any school and ask any educator of color who's been there 10, 20, 30 years. And I have to imagine there's got to be an inclusive community there, right? I mean, who is going to stay in a school that doesn't, at a bottom line, have that? And to be honest, as we're approaching hiring season as well, if you're bringing candidates of color into your building, I am imagining this is what they're looking for as well. You know, what does this community feel like? Can I talk to staff of color? Can I hear what their experience is like? Why have they been here so many years or so few years? So that is a great final one. Is there anything else that you would like listeners to know about this book in particular? I know it's a whole book in just a 30, 40-minute conversation. Is there anything else to add for now?
That cultural affirming leadership really at its core is about engaging anti-racism at its work, about engaging, like I said, kind of those racial systems of power. And so we want to kind of move beyond, those performative um, strategies, right? Those, I talked about equity training, kind of checking the box, right? But there's also really powerful equity training, right? That really moves below the surface, that really supports changes in mindsets and behaviors. I talk about racial affinity groups and all the strategies. Really, we want to look at them not just as how can we check the box, but how are we supporting and moving um, or really changing the culture of the building in ways that is affirming and welcoming and actively engaging systems of power that are deeply entrenched and that are also, if unchecked, deeply toxic to educators of color. So, I hope that folks pick up the book. I hope that they are willing to engage these ideas and that they're willing to be introspective and that they engage this work, not just as individuals, but also take it up with teams. This is important work and it can't be done in isolation, but it's also critical, right? We can't invite folks into a burning building. I think of the words of James Baldwin, who spoke to that effect. But I know that at its core, if we have buildings that are affirming to educators of color will stay, and it will also support kind of a larger community transformation where everyone will benefit from having these systems that are affirming, that are engaging, and that ultimately are supporting people to get better in their practice And at the end, if our teachers are winning, then our kiddos are also winning.
Thank you. And if listeners want to find you or your work or your coaching, where would you like them to go? Where can they go?
Yes, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I can also be found through my consulting website, so www.ilmconsultinggroup.com. That's ILM as in instructional leadership and management consultinggroup.com. I also am on Twitter and tweet occasionally. I love engaging with folks, and so definitely reach out. Would love to have a conversation with anyone who wants to engage more with these ideas.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Andrea Terrero Gabbadon. Support and retain educators of color, 6 principles for culturally affirming leadership. I appreciate your time and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.